I learned something about powerful men that night. They don't raise their voices, they lower the room. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not the quiet kind you get in a library or a church, but the kind that feels heavy in your lungs, like the air itself is waiting for permission to move. My father was standing in the middle of the room, his shoulders smaller than I had ever seen them. Robert Carter had always been a loud man. The kind who filled a house with his voice and his opinions and the smell of cheap coffee at 6 in the morning. But that night, in a private room behind a dim bar somewhere off a narrow Chicago side street, he looked like a man who had already lost something important. I stayed near the wall. That's where one of the men had quietly guided me when we walked in. Not shoved, not threatened, just a calm hand pointing to the corner like it was the only place I was allowed to exist. The room smelled like polished wood, smoke, and expensive cologne. A round table sat in the center under a single hanging light. And at the head of that table sat the man everyone else seemed to orbit around without realizing it. Adrian Volkov. I didn't know his name yet. I only knew the way the room bent around him. My father's hands were shaking. I had seen him nervous before, but never like this. He kept rubbing his palms together like he was trying to erase something invisible. "I told you I just need a little more time," he said, his voice thinner than usual. The man at the table didn't answer right away. He was turning a silver ring slowly around his finger, the metal catching the light each time it moved. Tap, tap, tap. The sound against the wood table was soft, but everyone heard it. Finally, my father's voice cracked. "I have no money." The words seemed to fall flat on the floor between them. No one rushed to pick them up. No one reacted at all. The man lifted his eyes. That was the moment everything shifted. Because he didn't look at my father first. He looked at me. It was quick at first, like he was confirming something he had noticed earlier. But then his gaze stayed. I felt it from across the room, steady and calm, like a spotlight had quietly turned in my direction. I straightened without meaning to. My heart started beating faster, but not from fear alone. It was something stranger than that. Curiosity. The man studied me for a few seconds that felt much longer. I suddenly became very aware of the scuffed floor under my sneakers and the faded denim jacket I had grabbed before leaving the house. I definitely didn't belong in a room that smelled like $1,000 evening. My father followed the direction of the man's eyes. When he realized who he was looking at, something like panic flickered across his face. "She's not part of this," he said quickly. "She just came with me." The man leaned back slightly in his chair. His expression didn't change, but the ring stopped tapping. The silence returned, thicker than before. Then he spoke for the first time. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Everyone is part of something. The words settled into the room slowly. I felt my stomach tighten, but I didn't look away. Something in me refused to drop my eyes. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was the strange realization that powerful men weren't always the ones shouting the most. He studied me again, this time with a hint of curiosity, like I was a puzzle piece he hadn't expected to find on the table. My father took a small step forward. "Please," he said. "She has nothing to do with my mistakes." The man's gaze shifted back to him at last. Calm. Unhurried. The kind of calm that made other people nervous. He rested his hands on the table and tilted his head slightly. And that was the moment I understood something I wish I hadn't. The night hadn't been about my father's debt. Not anymore. The night had just become about me. My father opened his mouth again, but no words came out this time. I had seen that look on his face only once before, the day the doctor told him his lungs were not as strong as they used to be. It was the look of a man realizing he had run out of options. Adrian Volkov leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the polished wood table as if the conversation had finally become interesting. The light above us reflected. In the silver ring on his hand, I noticed the details because I did not know where else to look. The room remained silent, yet it did not feel empty. It felt full of people waiting for a single decision. My father tried again. His voice sounded rough, like gravel under tires. He said that he could work it off, that he could find another way, that he just needed time. The words rushed out of him one after another, as if speed alone could fix the situation. Adrian did not interrupt. He simply listened, his eyes calm and steady. When my father finished speaking, the silence returned, heavier than before. Adrian glanced toward the men standing near the door. They did not move. They did not speak. They only watched him, waiting for whatever came next. Then his eyes returned to me again. I could feel the weight of that attention from across the room. It was not cruel. It was not kind either. It was something colder, something measured. Like a businessman evaluating a decision. My father followed that look and suddenly stepped sideways, trying to block me from view. It was too late. Adrian had already made up his mind. He tilted his head slightly, studying me the way someone studies a painting they have just noticed hanging on a wall. My heartbeat grew louder in my ears, but I kept my shoulders straight. I refused to shrink into the corner they had placed me in. Adrian finally spoke again, his voice calm enough to make every person in the room lean in without realizing it. He asked a simple question. He asked my father what he actually had left. My father swallowed hard. The answer was obvious. Nothing. The man at the table glanced at me once more, and the faintest hint of a smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. Not warm, not cruel, just certain. He lifted one hand and lightly tapped the table with his ring again. The sound echoed softly through the quiet room. Then he said something that made the air feel colder. He said that every debt eventually finds its balance. My father shook his head quickly, already sensing where the conversation was moving. He began to protest, saying that I had a job, that I had a life, that I was not part of his mistakes. Adrian listened, without interrupting again. When my father finished speaking, Adrian slowly stood up from his chair. He was taller than I expected, broad-shouldered, moving with the quiet confidence of someone who had never needed to hurry. The men by the door straightened immediately. Adrian took 2 slow steps around the table, stopping where the light reached the floor between us. For a moment, he simply looked at me. I met his gaze, even though my heart was racing now. Finally, he turned his head toward my father and spoke in the same calm voice as before. He said that if money was gone, then value must come from somewhere else. The room held its breath. Then he looked directly at me again and made a decision that changed the direction of my life in a single sentence. He said, "She will serve as the payment." I expected my father to shout. I expected him to argue or slam his fist on the table the way he used to when a bill arrived late in the mail. Instead, he just stared at Adrian Volkov like the world had quietly tilted under his feet. The words hung in the air for a few seconds that felt much longer than they should have. She will serve as the payment. My father shook his head slowly at first, like he thought he had heard wrong. Then the panic rushed in all at once. He stepped forward quickly and lifted both hands in front of him as if he could erase the sentence that had just been spoken. He said that I was his daughter, that I had nothing to do with his mistakes, that this was not part of the agreement. His voice echoed in the room, but it did not change anything. Adrian Volkov did not react to the volume or the desperation. He only watched him with the same calm expression, the same steady eyes that had already measured the outcome. I realized something in that moment. Powerful men did not argue. They decided. My father turned toward me suddenly, his face pale and his eyes wide with guilt. He looked like he wanted to apologize, but could not find the words fast enough. I felt something tighten in my chest when I saw that expression. Not fear, not anger, something closer to disappointment. Because deep down I knew he had walked into this room hoping someone else would solve a problem he had created. Adrian took another slow step closer to the light, and the movement alone made the entire room quiet again. No one interrupted him. No one questioned him. The men near the door watched him the way soldiers watch a commander. My father kept speaking, promising that he would find another way, promising that he would work every day until the debt disappeared, promising things that sounded smaller with every second. Adrian finally lifted one hand slightly, and the motion alone was enough to stop the words. The room went silent again. He did not raise his voice when he spoke. He simply said that every debt demands balance. His eyes moved to me once more. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat now, but I did not look away. I had spent most of my life watching people talk over each other, arguing loudly over nothing. This was different. This was a decision happening in slow motion. My father whispered my name like he was asking for forgiveness before anything had even happened. Something in me hardened at that sound. I stepped away from the wall and took 2 slow steps forward until I stood where the light reached the floor. Several of the men in the room straightened immediately, surprised that I had moved without permission. Adrian watched the motion carefully. I stopped a few feet from the table and looked directly at him. Up close, he looked even calmer than before, like a man who had already considered every possible outcome. I felt the fear in my chest, but I also felt something else rising beside it. Pride. I lifted my chin slightly and spoke before my father could start begging again. My voice sounded steadier than I expected. I asked him one simple question. I asked if this was how he ran his empire, by collecting daughters instead of debts. The moment the words left my mouth, the air in the room changed. Several men, near the walls, shifted their weight instantly, as if they had just heard something dangerous. My father inhaled sharply beside me, but Adrian Volkov did not look angry. If anything, he looked more interested than before. He studied me for a long, quiet moment, the faintest hint of curiosity returning to his expression. Then he said something that made my heart skip a beat. He said that most people in that room were afraid to speak to him. Then he looked directly into my eyes and asked why I was not. For a moment, no one moved. The question hung between us like something fragile that might shatter if anyone spoke too quickly. Adrian Volkov watched me with the same steady expression, but I could see something new behind his eyes now. Interest. My father whispered my name again, this time more urgently, as if saying it softly could pull me back to the corner where I had been standing before. I did not move. I kept my eyes on the man in front of me. Adrian slowly folded his hands together, the silver ring catching the light again. The room felt smaller suddenly, like the walls had leaned closer to listen. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but clear. He asked me again why I was not afraid. The truth was that I was afraid. My heart was beating so loudly I could feel the pulse in my throat. But fear and silence are not always the same thing. I took a breath and answered honestly. I said that fear would not change the situation, so there was no point pretending otherwise. One of the men, near the door, shifted his weight like he could not believe what he was hearing. My father closed his eyes for a second, the way people do when they know something has gone too far to take back. Adrian studied me for another long moment. His expression did not harden. If anything, it softened by the smallest amount, like he had just discovered a detail he had not expected. He asked my name. I told him Emily Carter. Saying my own name in that room felt strangely important, like drawing a line on the floor and refusing to step behind it. Adrian repeated the name once, slowly, as if testing how it sounded in the air. Then he nodded almost to himself. My father finally spoke again, his voice shaking as he tried one more time to fix the impossible situation. He said that I had nothing to offer, that I was just a girl with a job and a small apartment, and a normal life that had nothing to do with the kind of world inside this room. Adrian listened patiently. When my father finished, Adrian looked back at me and said something that surprised everyone. He said that sometimes normal people were more valuable than they realized. The room stayed quiet after that. I could feel every pair of eyes watching us. I asked him what exactly he expected from me if I was supposed to replace a debt measured in numbers I could barely imagine. Adrian walked slowly back toward the table and rested his hand on the polished surface again. He said that he had not decided yet. The honesty of the answer caught me off guard. I had expected a command, not uncertainty. My father tried to speak again, but Adrian raised one hand slightly, stopping him without even looking in his direction. His attention remained on me. He said that most people in that room would have begged or cried by now. He said that I had done neither. I felt my shoulders straighten without thinking. I told him that begging had never solved any problem in my life. For the first time, a faint smile appeared on his face, small but real. Then he said something that changed the tension in the room again. He said that the night was not finished yet. And before my father could protest again, he turned toward the door and gave a quiet instruction that made two of the men step forward. He said that Emily Carter would be coming with them. The words landed quietly, but they carried the weight of a command. Emily Carter will be coming with them. My father reacted first. He stepped forward so quickly that the chair behind him scraped loudly against the floor. He said my name again, louder this time, the sound filled with panic and regret. For a second, I thought he might try to stop the men who had already started walking toward me. But something in Adrian Volkov's calm posture made him freeze before he even tried. The two men approaching me did not look angry. They looked professional, like drivers waiting outside a hotel for a scheduled pickup. One of them gestured politely toward the door, as if we were simply leaving a meeting that had ended normally. The strange politeness of the moment made everything feel even more unreal. I looked at my father. His face had gone pale, and the confidence I used to see in him when I was younger had completely disappeared. In its place there was only guilt. He said he was sorry. The words came out quietly, almost swallowed by the silence of the room. I felt something twist inside my chest when I heard it, but I did not let it show on my face. Apologies did not fix situations like this. I turned my head back toward Adrian. He had returned to his chair and was watching the scene with the same thoughtful expression he had worn all evening. Like a man observing the final move of a chess game he had already calculated hours earlier. I asked him one more question before I moved. I asked if this meant I was his prisoner now. The room seemed to tighten again as everyone waited for the answer. Adrian leaned back slightly, resting one arm along the back of the chair. The silver ring caught the light again as he turned it slowly on his finger. Then he said something that surprised me more than the decision itself. He said no. He said prisoners were taken by force. Then he paused for a moment and added that tonight I was simply the balance to a debt. The distinction did not make the situation easier, but the calm certainty in his voice made it clear that arguing would not change anything. I nodded once, mostly to myself. Then I turned toward the door where the two men were waiting. My father called my name again behind me, his voice breaking this time. I stopped for a second, but I did not turn around. Some part of me knew that if I looked back it would make everything harder. The hallway outside the room was quieter and cooler, the muffled music from the bar drifting faintly through the walls. One of the men walked slightly ahead, while the other stayed a few steps behind me. Neither of them spoke. When we reached the exit door, the night air from the Chicago street rushed in, sharp and cold against my face. Parked along the curb was a long black car that looked far too expensive for the narrow street it occupied. The driver stepped out and opened the rear door without saying a word. I hesitated for just a second, glancing back toward the entrance of the building. I wondered if Adrian Volkov was still watching from somewhere inside. Then I realized something unsettling. My life had just changed direction in a single sentence spoken under a dim light in a quiet room. And somehow the most dangerous man in the city had decided that I now belonged in his world. The car door closed with a soft, solid sound that felt final in a way I could not explain. The driver returned to his seat, and the engine started with a low, quiet hum that barely disturbed the night air. I sat in the back seat staring out the window as the narrow Chicago street slowly drifted behind us. For the first few minutes no one spoke. The city lights reflected across the glass and slid across my hands as I rested them in my lap. I realized then that my hands were not shaking anymore. The fear had not disappeared, but it had changed shape into something steadier. Curiosity. The man sitting in the front passenger seat finally turned slightly toward me. His voice was calm and respectful when he spoke. He said that the ride would take about 20 minutes. That was the first time anyone had mentioned time since this strange night began. I nodded, even though he was not really asking a question. Outside the window, the streets grew wider and quieter as we moved farther from the busy bars and restaurants. The tall buildings of downtown Chicago stood like dark outlines against the cloudy sky. I wondered if Adrian Volkov was still inside that back room, or if he had already moved on to another meeting, another decision, another life-changing sentence spoken in the same calm voice. The thought made something strange settle in my mind. A man like that probably made choices every day that changed the direction of other people's lives. I wondered how many of those people had stood in the same place I had stood an hour earlier. The car slowed as we turned onto a long, quiet road lined with tall iron gates and carefully trimmed trees. The neighborhood looked nothing like the streets near my small apartment. Large houses sat far back from the road behind wide lawns and long curved driveways. The car eventually rolled to a gentle stop in front of a tall black gate. One of the men spoke a short message into a small radio, and the gate slowly opened with a smooth mechanical sound. The car continued forward along a stone driveway that curved toward a large house illuminated by warm golden lights. It did not look like the kind of place you see in movies with loud music and crowded parties. It looked calm, quiet, almost peaceful. That contrast made the situation feel even stranger. The car stopped in front of the entrance, and the driver stepped out quickly to open my door. Cold night air brushed across my face again as I stepped onto the smooth stone driveway. I looked up at the house, trying to understand why a man who controlled so much power would choose to live somewhere that felt so quiet. One of the men gestured toward the front door. He explained politely that I would be staying here for now. The phrase "for now" echoed in my mind as we walked inside. The interior of the house was warm and silent, the soft lights reflecting across polished floors and tall windows. It felt more like a private museum than a home. I followed them down a long hallway until we reached a wide staircase. The man stopped and turned to me again. He said that Mr. Volkov would arrive later tonight. Then he added something that made my curiosity grow even stronger. He said that Mr. Volkov had given only one instruction before we left the bar. He said that Emily Carter was to be treated like a guest until he decided otherwise. The hallway grew quiet again after the men walked away. Their footsteps faded somewhere beyond the wide staircase, leaving only the soft hum of distant air vents and the quiet ticking of a clock I could not see. I stood there for a moment in the middle of the polished floor, unsure what a guest was supposed to do in a house that did not belong to them. The word guest still echoed in my head. It sounded polite, almost comforting, but it did not erase the truth that I had arrived here because of a debt that was never mine. I slowly walked toward the tall windows near the end of the hallway. Outside, the long driveway curved through the dark lawn, the iron gate now barely visible in the distance. Beyond that gate was the rest of Chicago, the small apartment I rented, the job I would probably not show up for tomorrow morning. It felt strange how quickly an ordinary life could pause without warning. A soft sound behind me made me turn. A woman in her 40s stepped out from a side doorway carrying a folded blanket over one arm. Her posture was calm, her expression professional but not unfriendly. She said her name was Margaret and explained that she managed the house. Her voice carried the same careful politeness I had heard from the men who brought me here. She said Mr. Volkov had asked her to prepare a room upstairs for me. I followed her slowly up the staircase, my hand sliding along the smooth wooden railing as we climbed. The second-floor hallway was lined with tall doors and soft lights that made the place feel more like a quiet hotel than a private home. Margaret stopped at one of the doors and opened it for me. Inside was a large bedroom with a wide window overlooking the front lawn. The bed was neatly made, the sheets bright and perfectly straight as if they had been prepared hours ago for someone else. Margaret placed the blanket on the edge of the bed and said that if I needed anything I only had to ask. I nodded and thanked her, still unsure how to react to the calm kindness of someone working inside the home of a man like Adrian Volkov. When she left the room, I walked slowly to the window and looked down at the driveway again. The house remained quiet. Minutes passed. Then I noticed headlights appearing at the far end of the road beyond the gate. A car approached slowly, the beams cutting through the darkness before the gate opened again. Even from the second floor, I recognized the shape of the long black car. My chest tightened slightly as it rolled up the driveway and came to a smooth stop in front of the entrance. I watched as the driver stepped out and opened the rear door. Adrian Volkov emerged a moment later, tall and composed, his dark coat moving slightly in the night air. He paused on the stone steps for a second, glancing toward the tall windows of the house. I was not sure if he could see me from that distance, but something about the way he looked up made me feel as if he already knew exactly where I was standing. Then he stepped inside, and I realized the night was not finished after all. I stayed by the window long after the front door closed behind Adrian Volkov. From the second floor the house felt even quieter than before, as if the walls themselves understood that their owner had returned. I watched the driveway for a few seconds more, then the lights outside dimmed and the darkness settled again over the lawn. Somewhere downstairs a door opened and closed softly. Footsteps moved across the polished floor. Slow. Measured. The same calm rhythm I remembered from the room behind the bar. My heartbeat started to match that rhythm before I even realized it. I stepped back from the window and looked around the bedroom again. The place was too neat, too carefully arranged, like a hotel suite waiting for a guest who had not arrived yet. I wondered how many rooms in this house sat empty like this, silent spaces inside a life built on decisions that most people never saw. Minutes passed. I sat on the edge of the bed, listening. The quiet made every small sound stand out. The faint creak of wood somewhere in the hallway. The soft hum of air moving through vents. Then footsteps on the staircase. Slow steps climbing one by one. I felt my shoulders tighten, even though I told myself to stay calm. Whoever reached the top of those stairs would not be a stranger. The footsteps stopped in the hallway outside the bedroom. For a moment nothing happened. Then a soft knock touched the door. Not loud. Not demanding. Just two steady taps that somehow carried the same authority I had heard in his voice earlier that night. I stood and walked to the door before I could change my mind. When I opened it, Adrian Volkov was standing there exactly as he had looked outside the house a few minutes earlier. Tall, composed, the dark coat now resting over one arm instead of his shoulders. Up close, the quiet confidence around him felt even stronger, like the air adjusted itself when when he entered a room. For a second, neither of us spoke. His eyes moved briefly past me, taking in the room, then returned to my face. There was no anger there, no impatience, only the same thoughtful curiosity he had shown in that dim back room hours earlier. Finally, he stepped inside and closed the door gently behind him. The sound of the latch clicking shut seemed louder than it should have been. He walked a few steps farther into the room and stopped near the window where I had been standing before. The city lights beyond the lawn reflected faintly in the glass behind him. He looked at me for a long, quiet moment, as if continuing a conversation that had never really ended. Then he asked the first question since arriving. He asked if I was comfortable in the house. The normalcy of the question caught me off guard. I told him the room was more comfortable than anything I expected when his men placed me in that car. A faint smile appeared for half a second before disappearing again. He nodded slowly, like that answer confirmed something he had already guessed. Then his expression grew more serious. He turned the silver ring on his finger once, the same small motion I had noticed earlier that night. When he spoke again, his voice was calm but deliberate. He said that the reason I was here had not changed. The debt still existed. But then he added something that made the room feel different all over again. He said that before deciding what came next, he wanted to understand something first. And the question he asked next was the last thing I expected from the most powerful man in the city. He asked why I had chosen courage instead of fear when everyone else in that room had chosen silence.